This is week 165 of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I'm Anna Belokur, reporting to you from Kyiv, and I'll be taking you through the top stories from Ukraine this week. In the middle of our Monday editorial meeting, the day after Easter Sunday, we learned that Pope Francis had died at age 88. The world lost no time in noting that the Pope shed his mortal coil less than 24 hours after meeting with US Vice President J.D. Vance, inspiring many memes in Ukraine that a meeting between Vance and Russian President Vladimir Putin should be arranged immediately. Having served as Pope for 12 years, through many global catastrophes and societal shifts, Francis's legacy is varied and colorful. From his beginnings as a bouncer and janitor in Buenos Aires to his ascent to the papacy, he created a long track record of advocating for those on the fringes of society and for maintaining humility and modesty in his own life, even as a more decadent one was made available to him. For many, Pope Francis is seen as a radically progressive figure relative to his position. He did away with the protections that long allowed top church officials to get away with systemic abuses of power. He advocated for climate change awareness, decolonization, and acceptance of all religions. He was the first pope to advocate for gay rights, despite his reported penchant for using gay slurs. And just weeks before his death, he criticized US President Donald Trump's plan to deport migrants en masse, saying that it was a violation of dignity. But, all that aside, you may have guessed already that I'm not just here to eulogize the Pope as a progressive icon. His legacy in Ukraine is a bit more complicated than that. For nearly a century, the Vatican has held itself to neutral status in all armed conflicts, refusing to take official stances or mediate between parties, unless specifically called to do so by all sides. In the case of Pope Francis and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, this neutrality led to a failure to label Russia as an aggressor amid statements of support for Ukraine, leaving the question of blame open-ended. In calling for peace without defining the invasion as such, the Pope made some pretty damning statements that reflected the Vatican's long-standing affiliation with and admiration for Russia. In the early days of the invasion, the Pope repeated the line that Ukraine and the prospect of NATO expansion had provoked Russia into invading, a sentiment that only tends to stem from those sympathetic to Russia's imperial goals. In late 2022, he claimed that the worst war crimes committed by the Russian forces were not carried out by ethnic Russian soldiers, but by Russia's minority groups, saying that generally, the cruelest are perhaps those who are of Russia, but are not of the Russian tradition, such as the Chechens, the Buryats, and so on. For the record, Chechens, Buryats, and other populations that make up Russia's so-called autonomous republics are among the most oppressed groups by Moscow, with no option to secede or self-govern in any way without risking violent crackdown and erasure. Putting the blame on them for Russia's systemic war crimes is a move that reeks of Kremlin propaganda, and also is blatantly false. There's no data to suggest that Russia's war crimes are more endemic to ethnic minorities than ethnic Russians, and there are thousands of documented cases of both since Russia's invasion. In a 2023 call with young Catholics in St. Petersburg, the Pope encouraged Russian youths to remember their roots as heirs to a great empire, an empire that was enlightened, rich in culture and humanity, according to him. He followed it up by encouraging his subjects to never abandon this heritage, move forward with this, and thank you. Thank you for the way that you are, for your way of being Russian. You can see why Ukrainians might take issue with a message that Russia should draw on its imperial roots to preserve its future glory. All this is to say, it's hard to truly wax nostalgic about Pope Francis if you believe that imperial invasion and wide-scale war crimes should be wholeheartedly condemned. Given the Vatican's historical relationship with Russia and so-called neutral status, it's a long shot to hope that we'll see a full condemnation of the invasion from his successor, but we'll have to wait until after the conclave. And yes, I learned that word during Oscar season, to find out. At the Kyiv Independent, reader contributions are our main source of revenue. Shows like Ukraine This Week are only made possible by viewers like you. If you'd like to get more involved in the Kyiv Independent community, we have several membership tiers that give you access to our Discord community, exclusive content, discounts on our merch, and more. We have an active group of readers who have built a relationship with our newsroom and with each other, and we'd love to have you along. There will be a link to our membership page in the description below. I'd also like to thank everyone who donates directly via YouTube. Your support is greatly appreciated. Last Sunday, I noted U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio's April 11th declaration that if no progress was made in peace talks on the Ukraine-Russia war ASAP, the U.S. might withdraw from the effort entirely. This Monday, amid the flood of news about the Pope's death, the Trump administration doubled down by saying that a ceasefire had to be achieved this week and that the war needed to end immediately, or the U.S. would wash its hands of the matter. As usual, the Trump administration's squalling failed to achieve anything meaningful. That is to say, despite Trump's ultimatums, Russia is still invading, and Ukraine is still defending itself. No truce of any kind was achieved, and on the contrary, it was an incredibly heartbreaking week of attacks, with at least a dozen civilians killed here in Kyiv early on Thursday morning, in one of the largest strikes on the capital in months. While I'll elaborate more on the attack later, for now, I'll just say that the statements last week about many Ukrainian civilians being more on edge than they were before Trump's re-election still hold true. The more he negotiates with Putin, the harder Russia hits Ukraine. The US ended last week by saying that it had devised a plan for peace that they were very optimistic would be accepted by both Russia and Ukraine, although full details weren't revealed until this week. Since Monday, 2 reported items on this plan have been causing particular alarm in Ukraine and beyond. The idea that as part of a peace deal, Ukraine would be permanently barred from pursuing NATO membership, and that the US would formally recognize illegally occupied Crimea as Russian territory. The proposal, still reportedly under discussion, has sparked horror from Ukrainian civilians and leaders, concern from European allies, and condemnation from foreign policy experts, many of whom warn that such a move could have long-term geopolitical consequences. If after 11 years of illegal occupation, Russia finally is able to say that it's gotten away with redrawing international borders by force, it'll set a precedent for other military superpowers to do the same at will. President Volodymyr Zelensky, along with literally all other Ukrainian officials, has continued to consistently reject any proposals that involve ceding territory to Russia. Doing so would violate Ukraine's constitution, and amending said constitution is a process that would be near impossible, both ethically and logistically in wartime, even if the desire was there. Polls of Ukrainians, not including referendums held at gunpoint once territories are already illegally occupied, repeatedly show that the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians will not support ceding territory. Members of Ukraine's parliament denounced the proposal as dangerous and cruel, with others calling it a betrayal of the relationship between America and Ukraine, as well as a violation of international law. European allies have backed this stance, with European Commission Vice President Kaja Kallas stating that the EU will never recognize Crimea as part of Russia, reiterating that the bloc is unified in this stance. Kallas is the former Prime Minister of Estonia, so you can understand why she serves as a particularly strong voice on this issue. If Russia's illegal annexation of Ukrainian land is legitimized on the global stage, it's only a matter of time before the illegal annexations of Narva, Tallinn, and Tartu appear in headlines. As security expert Aaron Gash-Burnett told the Kyiv Independent, this isn't a negotiation, it's a surrender. One other important thing to note about the US's brutal and ill-advised proposal is that it contradicts Trump's own prior statements on the matter. During his first presidency, his administration adopted the Crimea Declaration, in which it was stated that the United States rejects Russia's attempted annexation of Crimea and pledges to maintain this policy until Ukraine's territorial integrity is restored. This stance was maintained by his successor Joe Biden, and no one in American leadership was campaigning for its reversal until the recent months in which Trump and his team have begun cozying up to, or more accurately, being embarrassingly dominated by the Kremlin. As Burnett pointed out to us, the US walking back its stance and recognizing Crimea as Russian, while also ruling out NATO membership for the rest of Ukraine, gives Russia everything it wants while leaving Ukraine completely vulnerable, meaning that the US would have negotiated nothing but a victory for Russia and a humiliation for itself. The absolute majority of people in Ukraine aren't prepared to recognize Crimea as Russian, or to accept a US decision to do so. For the people of Crimea, many of whom have been forced to choose between living under occupation and living in exile, it's unconscionable to accept the idea that 11 years of sacrifice, although certainly not the only years of Russian persecution that the peninsula has suffered, might have been in vain. One 21-year-old Crimean activist who spoke to the Kyiv Independent said that such a move would be a death sentence for Crimean Tatar identity, as well as a defeat of American democracy. My colleague spoke with a total of 10 Ukrainians, including those of Crimean Tatar descent, about what the US recognition of the annexation would mean for the people who call Crimea home. The stories will be linked in the description below, and they articulate the human cost of such a move far better than I ever can. Because at the end of the day, amid the nauseating back and forth of these months-long peace talks, that's the final word. When we talk about the hypothetical of ceding illegally occupied territories, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of human lives that will be condemned to Russian persecution if the world abandons them, with many more to follow. There was a particularly odious press conference on Wednesday where White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt said that both sides need to be prepared to walk away a bit unhappy in order to make a deal. The implication that Ukraine would be nothing more than a bit put out by more than a decade of invasion, thousands of lives lost, the condemnation of thousands more to an unlivable situation, and the foregone conclusion that Russia will reinvade in the immediate future is a bit rich on Caroline's part. For our next segment, I'll be handing it over to my colleague Francis, who is reporting from eastern Ukraine. I'll hand it over to him to give you an update on the front.
This is Francis Farrell coming for a little Frontline update from the Frontline itself. The situation remains intense but stable. Russia has upped attempts to assault and take Ukrainian territory, not only in one direction but in several places along the front line, including here in Donetsk Oblast. The hottest point at the moment is probably around Toretsk, the city which remains contested after almost a year now of heavy fighting, where Russia has brought in some of their best drone units that were serving in Kursk Oblast. The fighting here is, of course, on both sides at this point dominated by the use of drones, which is why we're here with one of Ukraine's best drone units. But otherwise, you might be thinking, what do the soldiers here think about all this news about peace talks going well, not going well, peace being around the corner? The answer is they're not thinking about it, to be honest. They're here doing their own work. They understand that Russia's showing no signs of stopping on the battlefield, and in the meantime, it doesn't help them at all to be reading this kind of news. They're just fully focused on what they need to do to defend their land. So the situation is particularly tough in Toretsk, but the fighting is intense in many places across the front line, including here near Pokrovsk, further up in Kharkiv Oblast, and also along the state border between Sumy Oblast and Kursk Oblast in Russia.
This weekend, Russia's defense ministry claimed to have recaptured the final Ukrainian-held village inside Kursk Oblast, although Kyiv has so far denied this. The big question now is how deep Moscow aims to push into Sumy Oblast, and if North Korean troops, the presence of whom Russia just admitted to for the first time, will be a part of that operation. On the same day, Zelensky and Trump briefly caught up at Pope Francis's funeral at the Vatican. The meeting, which both sides described as productive, was the first time they had seen each other since the disastrous Oval Office argument in February. New statements after the meeting suggest that Trump is finally realizing Vladimir Putin is not interested in peace, but amid open threats that the US could give up on these negotiations entirely, it's too early to see if this will translate into any real action.
As I mentioned before, this was not an easy week for Kyiv. On Wednesday night, A handful of my colleagues and I stayed late at the office doing a Reddit AMA session, which ended around 10:30 p.m. so that everyone could get home before curfew at midnight. I got a taxi home, ate dinner, watched one episode of 90 Day Fiancé, and went to bed. About an hour later, just after 1 a.m., everyone in the city woke up to the distinct sound of ballistic missiles, which is a much louder and less common sound than drone attacks. The explosions went on for multiple minutes, and the alert system warned that more waves of attack drones and missiles would be on their way throughout the night, which they were. This was the largest combined attack on Kyiv in months. The death count wasn't finalized until the next day because civilians were trapped under the rubble of the apartment buildings that were hit and flattened. Along with the 12 people killed, nearly 90 were injured, including 12 children and a pregnant woman. I said last week of the Palm Sunday strike on Sumy that Russia's only plausible motive was to kill as many civilians as possible. Once again, this type of massive attack can only be described as terrorism. Although Kyiv saw the worst of Thursday's strike, Russia also hit Zhytomyr, Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkiv, Poltava, Khmelnytsky, Sumy, and Zaporizhia oblasts, which notably don't have the same level of air defense as the capital. While the attack was happening, Poland's Air Force scrambled fighter jets in case any of the missiles flew into NATO territory. The chief of the Kyiv City Military Administration referred to the attack as Russian peace in all its glory. Friday was declared a day of mourning here in Kyiv. Donald Trump, who a day before had written on Truth Social that it's President Zelensky, not Putin, who's the main impediment to peace, called the attack on Kyiv not necessary, saying that it was very bad timing. I'd like to remind you that the week before, he called the Palm Sunday strike a mistake. And if you want to give him any benefit of the doubt that he didn't know a huge strike was coming when he made his post about Zelensky on Wednesday, just know that Vice President J.D. Vance reposted it after Russia's attack on Kyiv. As has been said many times by many people, if J.D. Vance doesn't think that Russia is an aggressor, then he shouldn't have any qualms about visiting Ukraine. What's the worst that could happen? European leaders were more unequivocal in their condemnation. A French foreign ministry spokesperson told reporters on Thursday that Russia's refusal to stop striking Ukrainian cities is slowing down peace efforts, while President Emmanuel Macron reiterated that the frustration at stalled talks should be directed at Russia, not at Ukraine. Latvia's foreign minister said that the strike was evidence that the butcher in the Kremlin is determined to continue the war. Moldovan President Maia Sandu echoed these statements and concluded with only force can stop this war. I ended last week by saying that continued Russian strikes are all but a foregone conclusion. Please prove me wrong, Donald. For our member question this week, I'll be asking my colleague Kate to give me a hand in answering. We have this question from Robin. Sorry for the incoming pun, but how popular was Pope Francis in Ukraine, given some of his remarks on the war, etc.? What do you think, Kate?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I should say, leading up to the full-scale war, Pope Francis was an extremely popular figure in Ukraine. It should be said that Ukraine is an extremely religious country. And while the majority of Ukrainians are Orthodox, we have a large number of Greek Catholics in Ukraine, and they are followers of the Catholic Church. So the Pope was their religious leader. When the comments made by Pope Francis started to come out, problematic comments, let's say, people were getting increasingly frustrated. Of course. At the same time, I have to say that there was a delegation of Ukrainians who were able to meet several times directly with the Pope. I know this for a fact. They remember him very fondly, despite some of these strange comments. So I think the lesson of the story here is that the situation was very complicated. I spoke about this a little bit in my recent article, how the Pope was trying to prolong a very entrenched tradition in the Vatican Vatican of neutrality, trying to act as a mediator to secure the release of Ukrainian children forcibly abducted by Russia, to return prisoners of war. But at the same time, yes, he did make some very problematic comments about the great Russian culture. And as I say in my article, this can possibly be tied into the long history between Moscow and the Vatican, and especially the Jesuit order, which the late Pope Francis was a part of.
Thank you so much for adding that. It really helps to kind of paint a full picture of how this news landed in Ukraine, and we'll also have a link to your article in the description below for people who want a bit more information and a bit more nuance. So thank you so much for that. That's all for this week. We'll be back next Sunday with more news from Ukraine. If you enjoyed this video, as much as anyone can enjoy a compilation of disturbing news, please consider becoming a member of the Kyiv Independent community. It's thanks to viewers like you that we can do this work, and we're so grateful for your support.